In the quiet town of Hamelin, nestled along the banks of the Weser River in northern Germany, the air was filled with an unsettling silence. The town was once prosperous, with cobbled streets, lively marketplaces, and homes that echoed with laughter and joy. But over time, a creeping menace had arrived, unseen but deeply felt. It began with a few rats, scurrying through the alleys and under the buildings, but before long, their numbers grew exponentially. The rats were relentless, gnawing through food stores, spoiling crops, and spreading disease. No matter how many traps were set or poisons applied, the rats kept coming. It was as if they were under some kind of spell, an unbreakable force pushing them forward. Desperation settled over the town like a thick fog. The townsfolk gathered in the town square, whispering in hushed tones about their misfortune. Farmers spoke of their ruined harvests, shopkeepers of destroyed goods, and the town's mayor, a weary man, tried to reassure the people with promises of solutions, though none came. Day by day, the rats multiplied, and the people began to fear not just for their food, but for their very health and lives. The town's once joyous atmosphere had been replaced by a haunting dread, with the rats growing bolder, invading homes, and even attacking livestock. One fateful day, as if summoned by the very despair that hung over Hamelin, a mysterious figure appeared in the town. He was unlike anyone the people had ever seen before, a man dressed in flowing, multicolored garments that shimmered in the sunlight. His clothes were a patchwork of vibrant hues, creating an almost magical aura around him. He was tall, with piercing eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages and a confidence that immediately set him apart from the usual townsfolk. The man's face remained calm, almost serene, and he carried with him a curious instrument, a pipe, ornate and carved with intricate designs. The townspeople, desperate for help, approached him in the square. They asked him who he was and what he could offer to end their misery. The man introduced himself as the PiedPiper, and he claimed to have the power to rid Hamelin of its rat infestation. There was something almost hypnotic in the way he spoke, and his calm demeanor soothed the growing tension in the crowd. The mayor, though skeptical, was intrigued. "And what is it that you ask for in return?" he inquired. The piper smiled, his teeth flashing briefly in the sunlight. "I ask for a fee, nothing more," he said. "Pay me what you believe my service is worth, and I shall rid your town of these creatures. But beware, for once I begin, I will not stop until the job is done." The townspeople, having nothing left to lose, agreed to the piper's terms. A collective sigh of relief passed through the crowd. Here, it seemed, was a solution to their greatest problem. Without further hesitation, the PiedPiper raised his pipe to his lips and began to play. The music was unlike anything the townsfolk had ever heard. It was a melody so enchanting, so perfectly harmonious, that it seemed to flow through the very air itself. The rats, as if drawn by some invisible force, began to appear, creeping from every corner of the town. They emerged from under doors, from behind crates, and even from the sewers. The melody called to them, and they followed it, as if they had no will of their own. The people watched in awe as the piper's music wove through the streets, gathering the rats into a massive throng. As the piper played, the rats moved in a massive wave, tumbling over one another in their frantic pursuit of the music. The townspeople could only stand in amazement as the piper led the creatures through the streets, out of the town, and toward the Weser River. The procession continued, the sound of the pipe echoing through the streets like a siren's call. The rats, too many to count, swarmed in perfect unison, and before long, the piper had led them to the water's edge. Without missing a beat, the piper's music continued, and the rats, seemingly hypnotized, plunged into the river, drowning one after another. The water turned dark with their bodies as the piper played on. It was a scene of surreal beauty and dark magic, a sight that no one in Hamelin would ever forget. It took hours, but by the time the last of the rats had fallen into the river, the town was free of its plague. The air was clear, the streets once again peaceful. The town was saved. The townspeople, overwhelmed with gratitude, rushed to the piper, eager to repay him for his extraordinary service. But when they gathered around him, they found their joy quickly turned to confusion. The piper, having finished his task, stood still, his eyes never wavering from the townsfolk. He waited patiently as the mayor stepped forward, smiling broadly, ready to give the piper his reward. But when the mayor offered him a sum of money far less than what the piper had requested, the mood shifted. The piper's smile faded, and a coldness crept into his eyes. The town was saved. The townspeople, overwhelmed with gratitude, rushed to the piper, eager to repay him for his extraordinary service. But when they gathered around him, they found their joy quickly turned to confusion. The piper, having finished his task, stood still, his eyes never wavering from the townsfolk. He waited patiently as the mayor stepped forward, smiling broadly, ready to give the piper his reward. But when the mayor offered him a sum of money far less than what the piper had requested, the mood shifted. The piper's smile faded, and a coldness crept into his eyes. He had asked for a fair payment, but the townspeople were already reneging on their promise. The mayor tried to reassure him that they were grateful, but the piper remained unmoved. The townsfolk had already begun to murmur among themselves, some suggesting that the piper's request was too much, that the task hadn't been as hard as they had imagined. The piper's patience began to wear thin. "You have agreed to my terms," the piper said in a voice that now held a note of finality. "And yet you refuse to honor your word." His eyes were hard, unblinking. The townspeople tried to backtrack, but the piper was no longer interested in hearing excuses. He stepped back from the crowd and lifted his pipe to his lips once again. This time, the melody that flowed from the pipe was darker, more foreboding. It sent a chill through the gathered townsfolk, and some began to back away, fear creeping into their hearts. But it was too late. The piper began to play, and the townspeople watched in horror as the same magic that had controlled the rats now reached for something far more precious, something far more irreplaceable. One by one, the children of Hamelin, drawn by the same enchanting music, began to gather around the piper. Their eyes were glazed, as if they were no longer fully aware of their surroundings. The townsfolk screamed in protest, but the piper paid them no mind. He was not a man who could be swayed once he had made a decision. The children followed the piper as he began to walk, his pipe playing a haunting tune that led them away from the town. The parents cried out, rushing after their children, but they were too late. The piper led the children out of Hamelin and into the mountains beyond, where the path grew narrow and treacherous. The townsfolk could do nothing but watch in helpless horror as their beloved children disappeared into the distance, their voices faint against the rising music. When the piper reached the mountain pass, he turned to the children and spoke softly. "You have been chosen," he said. "Come with me, and you shall never know suffering again. Your town has broken its word, and I have come to take what was promised." With that, the piper and the children vanished into the caves of the mountains, leaving behind only silence and the faint echo of the music. The town of Hamelin was never the same. The children were gone, and with them went the joy, the laughter, and the spirit of the town. The people who had once known only prosperity now lived in the shadow of their broken promise. The story of the PiedPiper was passed down through generations, a cautionary tale of the consequences of dishonesty and the importance of keeping one's word. And so, to this day, the legend of the PiedPiper lives on. The town of Hamelin still stands, though it is forever marked by the loss of its children. Some say that, on certain nights, the sound of a pipe can still be heard, drifting on the wind, a haunting reminder of the price that must be paid when promises are broken. Whether it is the piper himself, or simply the echoes of the past, no one can say. But one thing is certain, the legend endures, a warning to all who would dare to betray those who offer their help.